Hello everybody, Infinite Shinjo here. Welcome to today's video, and today I am here to list off 10 duels from Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's that should have happened. So Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's is one of my favorites. It was around when I was in high school, so it brings back fond memories for me. So at the same time, it was hard for me to decide 10 duels that I think should have happened in place of what we actually got. But I think I got some pretty good ones, so let me just remind you that these are in no particular order. I'm just listing them off. A lot of these duels did happen, but I think that a rematch duel or a duel done in a different way would be an interesting thing to see. So let's get started. So we're kicking this off guns blazing with Jack, Yusei, and Akiza versus Crow. So I mentioned this a couple of times before. The initial plan for the Dark Signer arc was for Crow to be the final villain. And it makes sense. The final Earthbound Immortal is a bird, and Crow uses birds in his deck. But from the rumors I'm hearing, they decided to change their minds because Black Wings were really popular. So in this timeline, I'm going with the idea of Crow being the final villain. And the duel with Crow facing off against Jack, Yusei, and Akiza, it can play off the same way that the duel between Rex did, but just with Crow instead. And not a turbo duel because Akiza can't use one. A joke duel that I came up with is Bolt Tanner versus Yanagi. So these two technically did duel, but after they got out of the facility, they were just palling around with Yusei and they did jack squat. So I think trying to squeeze a rematch duel between those two, especially after Yanagi saw how Yusei used his deck, would be a fun thing to see. Although I'm realizing now I probably should have taken out Yanagi and put Jack in, because I think there was something that was discussed in the series where Tanner did lose to Jack. But whatever, I'm sticking with this. On the list of Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's missed opportunities, we have Leo versus Sly. If you don't remember Sly, I don't blame you. He was a forgettable character. But the only way that I can explain Sly is there's an episode where Rudolph Heitman, who is definitely not Dr. Crowler because he uses the exact same deck, tries to kick out all the students, Leo and Sly being two of them. And Yusei decides to step in and duel against Heitman, and he takes each one of the duelist cards as a way to win. And Sly's cards is Eccentric Boy. Yusei wins the duel, they go off and celebrate, and Sly has some ominous line of, "I'll get you, Yusei," and that Stardust Dragon. Definitely paraphrasing that, but essentially, they kind of built Sly up to be antagonistic towards Yusei, even going to get his Stardust Dragon, but they didn't do anything with it. And considering that Leo's the dumb idiot of the class, I feel like these two dueling will be an interesting time. Or even Yusei versus this kid. Up next we have Leo versus Luna, and this one isn't that hard to explain. It's just the normal sibling rivalry trope. It can be just any time that they get into an argument and they decide to duel. Because out of all of the signer group, this one is the one that never happened, I'm pretty sure. Although Yusei and Crow facing off against each other never happened. Out of the whole of Team 5D's, this is the duel I wanted to see. Because they're essentially two sides of the same coin, so having them face off against each other would be an interesting time. Now here's where things get interesting. Crow versus Dark Signer Callan. So obviously, Callan has a grudge against Yusei. But at the same time, I feel like it would be very poetic if Crow faces off against Callan first, Crow loses, and turns to a Dark Signer. I feel like two members of Team Satisfaction dueling against each other, and that being the turning point that turns Crow to a bad guy, is just super poetic. And it makes more sense than Crow just turning into a bad guy for no reason. Up next is Jack versus Primo, and I have no logic behind this. I just think those two personalities, when they duel each other later on in the show, just work out well. And the fact that Leo and Luna faced off against Lester, another part of the trio, earlier, works out even better. Plus, I'm always down to give Jack another duel. I didn't plan to put these two duels back to back, but up next is Jack versus Lazar. So Lazar is Rex's right-hand servant, and Jack was essentially being tutored by Goodwin to become a good duelist. Essentially, Jack and Lazar butted heads a lot, and after Goodwin leaves, if we're going off of the story that Rex is the final villain, I think that Jack versus Lazar would be a fun duel to see, especially since I still remember Lazar versus Crow to this day. Lazar's just a fun character in general, and I'm upset that Lazar never got more duels. On the subject of fun characters that should have gotten more duels, up next is Carly versus Mina. And I'm not doing this on purpose, even though it just seems like it, but this is essentially a love triangle with Jack Atlas. Because obviously, Carly has feeling for Jack. It was very well apparent in the show. And Mina actually does as well. I don't blame you if you don't remember Mina either. Mina is just a character in the show. She never duels. But I think these two dueling, because both of them have feelings for Jack, would be just an interesting duel. Realistically, there's also a waiter in the cafe that Jack goes to that also likes him. But I think this duel is much more interesting. Next is Akiza versus Sherry LeBlanc. So like I said earlier in the video, Akiza doesn't know how to turbo duel. But after Yusei faces off against Sherry, Akiza decides, I want to learn how to turbo duel as well. And she successfully does. So I feel like Akiza facing off against Sherry, the one that inspired her to turbo duel in the first place, is just a great thing to see. If we're going off of the timeline that I created where Crow's the Dark Signer, that means that he's not going to be in the later part of the show, meaning Akiza and Sherry could happen right there. And finally wrapping up this video, we have Akiza versus Sayer. So this is going to take a little bit of explanation to get to this one. Essentially, Akiza and Sayer are both from some sort of psychic club, essentially. And Sayer kind of like brainwashes Akiza in some fashion, and he is essentially manipulating everything. Of course, Akiza does have psychic powers that can damage people. There's a character called Misty later on that she blames her brother's disappearance on Akiza, and come to find out, Sayer was behind the whole thing anyway, and he gets swallowed by an Earthbound Immortal. It was a fun time. But I think what should have happened, instead of them just cutting Sayer from the show, I think they should have had an arc where it is the Psychic Club. It can be Sayer as the leader and just a whole bunch of flunkies down below. And the final duel is Akiza versus Sayer. Because over the time of the show, Sayer kind of gets jealous of Yusei spending so much time around Akiza. So I like the idea of Akiza, who was brainwashed by Sayer at the start, duels against him and defeats him. Just let's be real, they should have done an arc on this. I mean, just look at Sayer's Thought Roller Archfiend and tell me this guy is not a villain. But that is my list of 10 5D's duels that should have happened. And honestly, going through these three, recording them back to back, I actually had a lot of fun coming up with ideas on which characters should duel. Let me know what you think about these duels. Let me know if you think any of them should have been different. Let me know if you think there are any modifications that you would have made. And look forward to the Zexal one, because if these three do well, expect the rest of the series. See you next time. Momentai.